The draft board looked like it was working in the Grizzlies' favor. Donovan Clingan didn't go 2. He didn't go 3. He didn't go 4. He didn't go 5. He didn't even go 6th. He went 7th, though. But then the Grizzlies were set up to pick 9. Dalton Connect was still there. Montes Buzelis was still there. But the Grizzlies said, no, we don't want either one of those guys. In fact, we've already had our guy keyed in this entire time. The Grizzlies selected Zach Edey from Purdue, one of the most accomplished college basketball players of the 21st century. We talked to Zach Kleiman after the draft on last night. He had a lot of things to say, and we're going to break everything down right here, coming up next on Locked On Grizzlies.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everyone, and welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host today, Damichael Cole, beat writer for the Commercial Appeal right here in Memphis, Tennessee, and welcome to a grand special edition of our post-NBA draft, first round edition, at least, coverage. As the Grizzlies selected Zach Edey out of Purdue, 7'4", 295, 300-pound center. As I mentioned, one of the most accomplished college basketball players of the 21st century. Two-time Wooden Award winner, two-time Naismith Award winner. All of those things. This is the guy. This is the big man that the Grizzlies selected to be the big man that's going to kind of roam the middle for years to come. But before we get to all that, today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms may apply. Well, let's get into it. There's a lot to kind of peel back here on today's show, so make sure you stay tuned with us all throughout the show because we're going to talk about everything inside the Grizzlies draft process into getting Zach Edey at 9. In our second segment, we're going to break down the Zach Edey analysis, what we've learned about him, what we know about him, what the stats say about him, and kind of what the Grizzlies thought process is with him. And then building up off of that in the Grizzlies thoughts process, you probably want to know what Zach Kleiman had to say as well, the Grizzlies general manager and president of basketball operations. Talk to him after the draft on Wednesday night, after the first round. And he had a bunch of things to say that I think will catch a lot of you guys' eyes. So we'll talk about that in the third segment as well. But let's get started in terms of why Zach Edey? How did it get to this point? And many of you, some people were not too pleased with the pick. Let me start here with myself because I know that there have been a couple of people say, oh, DeMarco, you haven't talked about Zach Edey as much as, Donovan Clingan or Dalton Connect or Khalil Ware and things like that. Let's be clear. I have no problem with the idea of adding Zach Edey on this team. There were guys that I favored over him. Yes, if Dalton Connect was on the board, I felt like that should have been the pick, or Khalil Ware. In quite frankly, in a trade down, Zach Edey made more sense to me. But the Grizzlies had their guy, and look, history will tell you, the Grizzlies have no problem. If they have a guy that they want, they will reach for him. You can say what you want about the Jake LaRavia selection or David Roddy selection or whatever the case may be. I specifically remember when the Grizzlies drafted Jake LaRavia, they told us that was the guy all along, and they traded up to get him. And even though it caught some of us as kind of like an out of left field move in the spot that he got. But with all that being said, inside the process here, basically, there were some reports out there about number 6 because if you've been following Locked On Grizzlies, we've talked about the idea that the Grizzlies, if they get Donovan Clingan, the spots 5th and 6th made the most sense. Donovan Clingan was on the board, and then the 5th pick came. Detroit kept its pick and drafted Ron Holland. So when that 6th pick got there, I was all eyes in, just trying to see what would happen because you knew that there would probably be some conversations between Charlotte and Memphis in that situation. And indeed there were. Multiple reports indicated, I think Yahoo Sports' Jake Fisher first, and then Adrian Wojnarowski at ESPN as well. Basically, Woj came out and said that The Grizzlies did have interest in trading up to number 6. Now, after the draft, Zach Kleiman, basically said that the Grizzlies got their guy. He said that this is exactly how the Grizzlies wanted the draft to play out. Was he saying that just because he didn't want to slight Edey in any type of way? Probably so a little bit, but I do think that the Grizzlies feel strongly about Edey. Um, Again, he wasn't the top option for me, but at the same time, he wasn't a bad option to me. I was never mad to the point where he was not a good option for the Grizzlies. I think he is a solid option. I said all along, the Grizzlies do not need a big man who's going to come in and be an all-star. They don't need that. If he becomes that, then great. But that's not what they need. They have those guys. They need someone who's going to fill in the pieces around those core players. And some of the things that Zach Edey does well kind of fits into that process. So, yes, there were some conversations at number 6 overall there. And I think, based on what we gather and based on what you can tell, that probably was to go trade up and get Donovan Clingan. Now, you don't get Clingan, you end up with Zach Edey, and again, Kleiman. We saw John Morant, Jaren Jackson Jr. A lot of people in the Grizzlies organization are very happy about this pick. So there is that part of it as well. Like they are thrilled with the idea of adding Zach Edey, no matter what happened at 6, and if they were trying to get Clingan or whatever the case may be. Sometimes things just don't work out. Whether it was the price or whatever the case may be, they still ended up getting a big in this range. So then there's another level here to kind of unveil with why the Grizzlies had this interest in Zach Edey and why he was the guy. When Zach Edey, because he was a senior, it's a 4-year player. When Zach Edey originally declared for the draft after his junior year, he tested the waters and then decided to come back to Purdue. That was when the Grizzlies kind of really did their homework on him. They were very interested in Zach Edey last year. I mean, this is a guy that they've been, again, interested in for over a year. So they watched him closely this year. And last year, they talked to him. And based on those conversations, Zach Kleiman kind of already got a feel for this guy being a fit, culturally and just, fitting around the team. And then there's other cores, there's other layers to the idea of adding Zach Edey as well. We talked about the fact that the players are pretty much on board with it. The main players that you want to be on board with are your star guys. Desmond Bane sent out a tweet, on X. He sent out a post on X, formerly known as Twitter, and he said, "Let's go," in all caps, indicating how excited he was about the move. Jaren Jackson Jr. posted the little salute emojis as well. And then there's John Morant. John Morant went a little bit step further. Shout out to the fans of Rush Hour out there. Rush Hour 3 had a scene where Chris Tucker, Detective James Carter, walks in a room and he sees this kid, this karate kid that's gigantic, and he looks up at him and it's just like, whoa. John Morant reshared that clip on his Instagram account, and he posted another picture, and that probably went over a lot of people's heads. But he posted a picture of some of his associates taking a photo with Zach Edey at Summer League last year, and there's more to that photo than you know. John Morant's trainer is Trey Draper. It's one of his trainers. Trey Draper was at IMG Academy. Trey Draper is also a Memphis native. He was at IMG Academy all of the years that Zach Edey was there in high school. IMG is where Zach Edey was before he attended Purdue. So there is already a familiarity from one of the main people in Ja's camp to Zach Edey. There's already a direct tie into John Morant there. So look, it sounds like the people in Memphis are excited. I was talking to another person who told me that Memphis is going to love Zach Edey as well. So all things considered, the process, it seems like the Grizzlies did their homework. It's homework that's been done well over a year on the idea of adding Zach Edey to this team. But what are they going to get in Zach Edey? That's what we got to really get into next. The analysis, the nitty gritty. I have a lot of takeaways in terms of how he can fit and what his game will look like on this Grizzlies roster. Let's talk about that next. But before we get to that, today's episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is the authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on Game Time apps actually go down closer when it gets to first pitch. Because me, I love to go check out a good baseball game in the summertime. I'm trying to get out to Atlanta real soon. For you that don't know, I'm a big Atlanta Braves fan. I got to get down to Atlanta soon. And when I get down there, I'm going to use Game Time to get some of those killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and you get the lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. I'm telling you, you get the last-minute deals, you get some flash deals, you even get zone deals where you can save even more when you choose a section and you just let Game Time choose the seats for you. It's the lowest price guaranteed, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Again, Game Time will be the lowest price, and if it's not, they'll just credit you 110% of the difference, because your purchase is also covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. How do you take advantage of this? Well, it's simple. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms may apply. Again, all you got to do is create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA, LOCKED on NBA for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Coming up next here on Locked On Grizzlies, we got to talk about the fit. How does Zach Edey fit in Memphis? Stay tuned for that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies, everyone. I'm Damichael Cole, beat writer of the Commercial Appeal here in Memphis, Tennessee, talking about the Zach Edey fit. We went inside the process. I know there were questions about, did the Grizzlies even try to trade up? Multiple reports indicated that was the case. And if they had tried to trade up, it probably was going to be for Donovan Clingan, because Memphis coincidentally tried to get 6, and Donovan Clingan went 7th. So with all that being said, now we're past all that. Let's talk about the guy that's here, right? Zach Edey is your guy now. This is the guy. And where do the Grizzlies go from here? Where does Zach Edey in the fit go from here? Well, let's start here. There's a lot to uncover with this play. He averaged over 25 points and 12 rebounds as a senior. Naismith Player of the Year, Wooden Player of the Year, easily top college basketball player in the world this past season. And he was as a junior as well, 22 points a game, 13 rebounds a game, averaged over 2 blocks in his junior and his senior season. The rebounding was great. That is something that stood out to the Grizzlies as well. They wanted to put a guy who could really dominate the glass on the floor, and that's something Zach Edey has demonstrated that he can do in his 4 years of college basketball. But how about we start here before we get into the offensive and the defensive stuff? There's the fact that in Zach Edey's senior year, Purdue went to a more, and this is going to transition us into the offensive side. Purdue went more to an NBA style kind of offense. If you watch Purdue the last 2 years, because they've been a number 1 seed both years, primarily because of Zach Edey. If you watched them a couple years ago, you noticed that it was a lot of throw the ball into the paint to Zach Edey, and a lot of guys were just watching. And it's let him cook, let him destroy other teams, and he did that for the most part. But when they got to the NCAA tournament, they were an early out, primarily because a team figured out, hey, look, take away Zach Edey, you win the game. Simple. This season, Purdue said, you know what, we're going to do more of an NBA-style offense, and that kind of benefited Zach Edey. What did they do more of? Well, there was constant movement. There were a lot of ball screens. There were a lot of actions ran, and it looked more like an NBA offense. You put the ball in Zach Edey's hand, they ran actions off of it. There were a lot of screening, and a lot of movement. So all of that bodes well for how Zach Edey transitions to the NBA. Now getting into his offensive game. The one thing that stands out about Zach Edey is just dominance in the paint. You got to start there. This is one of the most dominant paint scorers in college basketball the 21st century, period. He will destroy mismatches. And this is something that really stands out, particularly of how he fits with the Grizzlies. When Ja Morant has the basketball, and he's a good screen setter as well. If you look at Ja Morant in the past, he played with Jonas Valanciunas, he played with Steven Adams. Who did Zach Edey compare himself to at the Scout Combine in May? He said he said I'm a paint presence. That's how I do my work in the paint. Paraphrasing, but he basically said that he compared himself to Steven Adams, Ivica Zubac, and Jonas Valanciunas. Two of those guys so happen to be the last two primary starting centers for the Memphis Grizzlies. So if you get anything like that out of him, I think it's a win. But I got to start with the mismatches point, because as good as Steven Adams was for the Grizzlies, because he was less usage than Jonas Valanciunas, which allowed for Ja and other guys to shine a little bit more. But Steven Adams, as strong as he was, he never really took advantage of mismatches the way I expect, someone his size to really do so. I think it was more evident in any series than the most evident it was when the Grizzlies played Golden State, right? They played Golden State second round of the playoffs, and you're watching that series, and Steven Adams gets put in the starting lineup after he, started the season coming off the bench. He gets put in the starting lineup, and the Warriors are starting Draymond Green. And then the Warriors are switching everything. And you got guys like Andrew Wiggins and all these other smaller guys against Steven Adams, and he's not scoring 20 points. And I remember being out there in San Francisco with my hands on my head like, how? How is he not dominating this matchup? But with Zach Edey, you don't got to worry about that. In college, there were 2-3 defenders around his vicinity at all times. And in the NBA, with more space and things like that, there is more potential for him to dominate the paint. He drew a lot of fouls in college as well. That craftiness should easily translate to the NBA. I know a lot of college basketball fans that were hating on Zach Edey's style. You weren't a big fan of that, but it's a craftiness that can translate to the NBA. He was very good, getting guys' arms trapped in his arms and drawing fouls and things like that. He's a solid free throw shooter, 70% free throw shooter as well. So those are the good offensive traits that really stand out. Again, he's going to take advantage of the mismatches, and he sets really good screens, and he's going to be a lob threat. I think that's pretty much what you need him to be offensively. You don't need him to shoot that many three-pointers, even though at the scouting combine, if you saw, he made 14 of 25 three-point attempts during the drills. But you don't need him to do that. If he adds that, then hooray, you win even more. But at the same time, you just need him to win at it in his role. You got the star players. You got 3 guys in start lineup that could potentially average 20 plus points. You don't need him to be anything amazing on that end. Now on the defensive end, you do need him to be amazing. And does he have the potential to do so? Yes. This is a schematic fit here in terms of how does he fit with the Grizzlies. The Grizzlies want to use Zach Edey as a drop defender, which you look at Rudy Gobert for over most of his career, mainly in Utah. They used him as a drop defender, which allowed him to pretty much stay in the paint a lot. You look at Brook Lopez in Milwaukee when he's been a Defensive Player of the Year candidate. It's been mainly as a drop defender. Those are 2 guys. More so Brook Lopez than Rudy Gobert, because Rudy Gobert guarded on the perimeter a little bit more this year. But Brook Lopez, to me, hasn't really been a good, isolation defender on the perimeter. But where he shines is he is one of the best defensive centers, defensive anchors when it comes to playing in drop coverage. The Grizzlies want to say, hey, let's throw Zach Edey in drop coverage and let him play to his strengths. The foot agility is a question mark. He gets on the perimeter. You saw it at the collegiate level. There were a lot of times where he got beat off the dribble, but there's not as much space in the collegiate level. So he makes up that, with that 7'11" wingspan and a 7'4" height, he can kind of close that gap a little bit more when guys beat him off the dribble. In the NBA, it's going to be harder to close that gap. That is a question. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the last segment. But that is a big question mark for Zach Edey. Yeah, I think that's going to be the one team where teams see him and they say, look, we got all these explosive wings, these quick guards. Go at him. Make the Grizzlies say, look, we got to take you out of this game. That's what teams are going to try to do. But what the Grizzlies are going to try to do is they're going to put him in that drop coverage, let him kind of be, a dominant paint defender. and you try to shoot that mid-range shot, they're going to try to depend on him to close the gap because he has a 7'11" wingspan, which he's capable of doing. He averaged over 2 blocks each of the last 2 seasons. And guys just really weren't trying Zach Edey like that. Like, they weren't even trying to go in his paint and be in his area. So what I think is, offensively, I think it's going to be an easier transition for him. The Grizzlies are not going to ask him to do a lot, and I think that'll be an easier transition. Defensively, there could be some hiccups, but it's a simplified role in terms of the Grizzlies won't be asking him to go out on the perimeter to the guard much. They want him to be a drop defender. But one thing about the Grizzlies and one thing about Taylor Jenkins is he likes to mix up coverages. So there may be times where he just say, the heck with it. Like, Zach, you got to hold your own out there. And Zach Edey is going to have to hold his own. One thing that Zach Kleiman pointed out to me as well, pointed out to the media, and he basically said that Zach Edey had to play kind of with a real controlled aggressiveness at Purdue. Because if you watch Purdue, it was Zach Edey's team without a doubt. Like, that team without him is nowhere near a number 1 seed probably. With all respect to what Purdue did this year. Braden Smith, really good player, and they have some other good players as well. But without Zach Edey, it's a completely different team. Everything revolved around him on the offensive and defensive end. He was so important to the team that Kleiman kind of pointed out the fact that he averaged 1.9 fouls, basically 2 fouls in 32 minutes of game time. They didn't want him to get off the floor. Now with the Grizzlies, he's not going to play 32 minutes. Steven Adams, Jonas Valanciunas, none of those guys, they're not asking centers to play 32 minutes in Memphis. So with that being the case, yeah, you're going to play 24, probably 25 minutes. If you're in that starting role, go out there and be as aggressive as you want. You can pick up 3 or 4 fouls. It's fine. If those guys come to the rim, knock them around if you can't block the shot. He didn't have that leeway, I would say, at Purdue. Now he has that in Memphis, and that's going to be a big key to how he can progress, how aggressive he can be on the defensive end as well. Coming up next here on Locked On Grizzlies, Zach Kleiman, the Grizzlies general manager and president of basketball operations, talked to us after the NBA's first round concluded. We got to talk about what he said. But before we talk about what he said, I want you to remember something. Because are you watching Fox Sports and ESPN on your TV all day and you have to turn the volume down because they're doing all that shouting? Make the switch over to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest sports stories without all the screaming and hooping and hollering. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, which is your team each and every. Up here on Locked On Grizzlies, let's talk about Zach Kleiman and what he had to say. Stay tuned for that. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies, everyone. I'm Damichael Cole, beat writer for the Commercial Appeal here in Memphis, Tennessee. Recapping what we talked about so far, we went inside the process. How did the Grizzlies get to Zach Edey at number 9? Zach Kleiman said, this is the guy we wanted all along. There were some reports out there that said, you actually wanted to move up to number 6, but you didn't get to move up to number 6 because of whatever that unfolded between the Grizzlies and Charlotte. But nonetheless, the Grizzlies end up with Zach Kleiman, who I think offensively will have an easier transition to the NBA. Defensively, a couple more question marks there, how he'll play in space and things like that. But it's not like they're going to ask him to play 30-plus minutes. So they're going to try to play to his strengths. Now, let's expound on that a little bit because Zach Kleiman said something important that I've kind of said myself in the past. But one thing that stands out about the addition of Zach Edey is one word: optionality. You may say, well, what does that mean? What does optionality got to do with anything here? The Grizzlies needed the flexibility to be able to say, we can go against any team in the Western Conference. Any type of way you want to play it, we're ready for it. If you want to play small, we can throw Jaren Jackson Jr. at the 5. Throw, Vince Williams at the 4 maybe and throw a couple extra wings out there. You want to play, you got a Karl Anthony Towns like type big who's very mobile. May cause some trouble for a guy like Zach Edey. Oh, no problem. You got Brandon Clark. And we can switch everything with Brandon Clark, Jaren Jackson Jr. both in the game at the same time. Net rating numbers, by the way, have been terrific anytime they've been on the floor together over the last 4 years, 5 years. Then, okay, what if you're going against Rudy Gobert and Ivica Zubac. Remember, Domantas Sabonis had that 20 rebound game against the Grizzlies. Looked like he was about to go for 30 boards. I think he had 25. What about when you're going against Sabonis? When you're going against Zubac? When you're going against Rudy Gobert? When you're going against Jokic? What about those big, bulkier guys that are going to cause you some trouble? Well, now you got Zach Edey. That's who he's for. You didn't draft Zach Edey to guard Karl Anthony Towns 25 feet, 30 feet from the basket. You draft him to be able to bang with Rudy Gobert, to be able to bang with Ivica Zubac, so he won't be able to have those 15 and 20 type nights. Or Domantas Sabonis won't have those 20-20 type nights against you. Or even against Jokic. So he won't just be tipping the ball to himself around the basket. That's what Zach Edey is here for. Optionality for any team is important. The best teams in the NBA can beat you in a bunch of different ways. The Grizzlies, they've had the potential to go 5 out against you. They have the potential, to match up late in games with Brandon Clark and Jaren Jackson Jr. and switch everything and have two mobile defenders with size and who can play, close to the rim on the offensive end. Zach Edey gives you that paint presence on both sides, right? Offensively and defensively. And it gives you that optionality. That's important because that kind of shores up one of the weaknesses that the Grizzlies had. I think optionality is one of the things that stands out to me in terms of what he will bring to this team. He gives you that physical. I mean, we're talking 7'4", 300 pounds. We ain't talking no skinny 7'1", 200-pound kids that gotta go eat his Wheaties and eat 2 breakfasts and all that. He ain't got to do none of that. He's ready to bang with the big boys right now. He's ready for that. So you factor all that in. Then there's another level. There's the fit with the stars. Kind of talked about this a little bit. Start with Jaren Jackson Jr. Now we'll start with Ja because we already kind of mentioned the Ja part. So we'll skip past that real quick. But again, Ja Morant, pick and roll, Zach Edey. Let's break it down real quick because we've seen it with Steven Adams so many times. Like Ja Morant thrived, was at his best when Steven Adams would set that hard screen and teams didn't want to switch, because that's what's going to happen with Zach Edey. It's going to be when you set a 1-5 screen, even if it's Herb Jones, for example. Like we see teams, sometimes a lot of teams guard Ja Morant with bigger defenders. Let's say Herb Jones, arguably the best wing defender in the NBA. Let's use him for example. Let's say you got Herb Jones guarding Ja Morant, and Zach Edey sets that hard screen. Ja's quick, so now you're trailing behind him, and Ja's so quick you ain't catching up. So you got to probably switch it. And if you force that switch, Zach Edey with Herb Jones on him is food. Zach Edey with any smaller defender on him in the NBA is food. They're going to have to bring the double. And he averaged 2 assists his last year, at Purdue. He showed the ability to pass the ball. Again, when he had more guys moving off of him, really took advantage of that his last year. So the prospects of Ja Morant and Zach Edey, Edey setting those screens, creating space for Ja. That was something just reading about and looking at what people at Purdue were saying. Zach Edey does a really good job of creating space for those guards. Ja don't need people to create space for him. Ja can create space for himself. But to have that, you don't need me to tell you what that means. I don't have to tell you what that means. That spells problem. Not for the Grizzlies. For the opponent. Now then there's the Jaren Jackson Jr. angle. Because these are the 2 All-Stars. Desmond Bane, probably, he's a Grizzly star, but the 2 All-Stars on the team right now, the guys who've been there, are Jaren Jackson Jr. and Ja Morant. Well, Jaren Jackson Jr., we talked about it a bunch. Like this year, he didn't make first team all-defense team, didn't make the second team. After the last 2 years, he was first team all-defense, won Defense Player of the Year in 2023. And a lot of that was because he played center more this year than he played power forward, which took away his ability to be a roamer. He had to be the guy who's protecting the rim a little bit more. Now, as we said, the Grizzlies are going to be playing drop coverage with Zach Edey, which means he's going to have 2 feet planted in the paint a lot. He's going to take 1 foot out of the paint every now and then because you got to worry about 3 seconds and all that. So I'm interested to see how all that plays out. Again, that's part of the question marks for Zach Edey. But with Jaren Jackson Jr., now he gets to be more of that roamer again. And that bodes well for the Grizzlies. That bodes well for Jaren Jackson Jr., kind of returning to that defender who was averaging over 2.5, close to 3 blocks per game. And we know what Zach Edey is going to be. He's going to protect the rim as well. Now you got two guys that are basically going to tell teams, don't you come in our paint. Don't you dare come in our paint. So that's what you got here. Overall, again, I think Zach Edey is a solid pick. Would I have selected him at number 9? No. I would have traded down and probably tried to get him a little bit later if I could have at 13, 14. The next big that was selected was Khalil Ware at number 15. So unless one of those teams just, also like Zach Edey more than the other bigs, those teams were taking guards and wings. So value-wise, I'm not great on it. Fit-wise, I'm great with it. That's the difference. I don't like the value. I love the fit. So that's how I feel about the Zach Edey addition to the Memphis Grizzlies. And there's also more work to be done. Again, we're talking about Zach Kleiman's comments. He also added, because there's a second round that'll happen here. He added that the Grizzlies, they like the way that the board shaked out. He's not going to say too much more than that because doesn't want to tilt his hand in any direction. But the Grizzlies have the 39th pick. They also have the 57th pick in the second round. Will be interesting to see where they go. I've been a opponent. I've basically, been on the record saying that the Grizzlies need shooting. Baylor Shireman was the last pick of the first round. Caught my eye. Terrific pick by Boston there. But there are a couple guys that stand out. Johnny Furphy shot 35% at Kansas, but the stroke, for a freshman looks promising as well. He's one that catches my eye. Jalen Wells, again, I've said his name. He's a guy that the Grizzlies have done their extensive reports on. Will Jalen Wells be that guy? He'll be available potentially at 39 or even 57. That's another guy that they could target as well. But I think shooting is a primary need as we go into the second day. Maybe they'll go for backup point guard play or something like that. But I just think another wing shooter, in addition to put around the Zach Edey's and the Jaren Jackson Jr.'s and the John Morants and the Desmond Bains of the world. But we'll see how Zach Edey fits overall on the team. There's so much more to talk about. We got to talk about Summer League. We got to talk about if he's going to be there. We got to talk about, him playing in the Olympics because right now he is on the Canadian roster. So many things to talk about. We'll talk to Zach Edey on Friday as well. But make sure you stay tuned for tomorrow's episode of Locked On Grizzlies too, because we're going to talk about the second round selections. Grizzlies have 2 picks in the second rounds. But before you get out of here, remember that Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV in the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On. Plus, our national shows are covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. Make sure you come with us tomorrow. We got to talk about the second round. 2 picks. The Grizzlies might trade up, might trade down. We'll see how it happens. Zach Kleiman again. He liked the way the board shaked out. So we'll see what that means because these picks are just as important. And we got to talk more about Luke Kennard. He talked about him as well, but we'll talk more about that all on tomorrow's edition of Locked On Grizzlies. But appreciate you guys for tuning in to Locked On Grizzlies today. Remember that Locked On Grizzlies is free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, I'm Damichael Cole, and we'll see you on Locked On Grizzlies.